Welcome, welcome. My name is Sherry Kling, and I am Director of Process and Faith. Process and Faith is a program of the Center for Process Studies, and we are a multi-faith network for relational spirituality. And we try to offer different kinds of programs that have to do with spirituality and faith, and sometimes they're specifically oriented toward a religious tradition, but sometimes they're not. And so this evening is one of those times when they're not. It's not oriented toward a specific tradition, but we try to offer a variety of topics for people to learn and discuss and join us in conversation and community. So we're really glad you're here. At the end of this event, before we close, we'll put in the chat a link to an upcoming event we have with Dr. Chad Ball on December 11th, and he'll be talking about the death of supernaturalism. So we'll put a link in the chat to that later, but that's our next event coming up in December. And this event is being recorded, so you will get an email once it's ready and published to our YouTube channel. You'll get a link so that you can watch the recording. And for those who couldn't be here tonight, of course, they can watch it as well. So let's jump right into our evening, which is we'll be hearing tonight from Dr. Travis Cox, who's from Naropa University, talking about ecopsychology, plant medicine, and the sacred earth. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Travis. He's associate professor in the Master's in Ecopsychology and the Bachelor's of Environmental Studies at Naropa. And he's been studying consciousness throughout his career in academia, both as a student and as faculty. And his interests in psychedelics are at the intersection of activism, philosophy, sustainability, and ecopsychology. And he's presented at different conferences. I won't get into all of those, but he was part of an event that I was part of in Claremont in 2019, called Can Exceptional Experience Save the World? And I was particularly talking more about dreams than anything else as dreams as mystical experience. But a lot of the other presenters were talking about psychedelics, and it was very interesting. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to you, Travis, and you can get rolling. And then when you're done sharing some information, we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sherry. Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
super excited to be here. I'm going to jump straight into my PowerPoint presentation, and then kind of roll through that. And feel free as we're going along. I'm going to do the Mr. Rogers thing. We're old enough, I think, that we know who that is. I have to check. I have like these blue blocker glasses on because I'm in front of the computer all the time. So instead of changing my shoes, I'll change my glasses so that I can don't have such a creepy profile, maybe. Um, so I'll just roll through the PowerPoint presentation, and then if you have questions, like feel free to just put them in the chat, and then Sherry's going to kind of field the questions, and then after I present everything, we'll just come back to those questions, and I can just run back through the slides too if I need to, if it's something in particular that you had a question about. Let me start. We'll take you through our agenda today. First, I'm going to do a quick introduction of who I am beyond Sherry. Like, why do I have any business talking about these crazy things? I'll give you a little understanding of ecopsychology. I'll give you my understanding of process philosophy, and Sherry and I were just talking about how much I miss these spaces. I wrote about process metaphysics for my dissertation, but I don't play in that sandbox much anymore. And so, if anybody here has a different understanding, especially one that kind of will help with the project of ecopsychedelics that I'm going to invite you all into, um, then I would love to hear it. And then, yeah, with ecopsychedelics, today I'll primarily be focusing on the aspects of it that invoke an investigation of worldviews. And we'll talk about a little bit about scientific materialism, some about animism. And then the question that I am in love with is there something like a psychedelic worldview? And so we will talk about that. So again, here's me levitating. Um, who is this guy? So my social location, I'm a cisgendered, able-bodied, heterosexual, middle-class, middle-aged white male, right? So I definitely am coming from a place of privilege, and I'm trying to recognize that like I have a lot to learn in the world relative to the way that that privilege can put up some blinders. Um, I got a BA in philosophy. My master's is in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies, where Stan Groff and Ralph Metzner taught. Um, I got my PhD in sustainable agriculture at Iowa State University. So if that seems off the wall relative to what I'm talking about now, feel free to ask me about that later. But I did it on the philosophy of sustainability using agriculture as a case study, and then with the understanding that worldviews are important in enacting sustainable agriculture, that it's not just the practices, that it is also a change in mindset. I taught at the Maharishi University, that's the Beatles guru, that was in Iowa, just south of Cedar Rapids. Um, I now teach at ecopsychology in the ecopsychology masters at Naropa. And if you're interested, I did a graduation address in 2019 where I cried about climate change and yelled at everybody to take psychedelics. I'm not, it was, I'm only being somewhat facetious. You can find that on YouTube if you're interested. Um, when we first started thinking about ecopsychedelics, I was working with an organization in Boulder that is the oldest psychedelic assisted therapy organization in Colorado. It's been around for over 10 years with a gentleman named Daniel McQueen. Sherry already talked about the conference. I'll show you the poster that I presented at a sustainability conference in 2019. There was also, I helped at the conference at the University of Exeter. I've taught the psychedelic assisted therapy class at Naropa and also taught in the psychedelic assisted therapy certificate at Naropa. Um, some colleagues of mine and I did a workshop at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS conference in Denver in 2023. And then I'll talk a little bit about last year. I taught an undergrad course at Naropa in ecopsychedelics. So I'm going to start with just the academic discipline of ecopsychology in a little bit. And just so you know, that's not none of my photos are AI generated. These are all actual photography, not mine, but from the web. And so that is, a forest refracted through a dewdrop. Ecopsychology. So in 1992, Theodore Roszak coined that term in a book that was titled Voice of the Earth. And so in terms of an academic discipline, that this is when it starts, really, is in 1992. In 1995, there's an edited text called Ecopsychology. It looks like this. Um, and that's pretty famous. There's a lot like Al Gore is in there. Yeah, there's a lot of uh, Jane Goodall writes about it. And so that's kind of where it entered into, I would say, like popular culture as much as it has. Um, the easiest way of thinking about it is James Hillman kind of takes it apart in it like etymologically. So psycho, and logos, right? And so James Hillman just says that ecopsychology is simply knowing that the earth is home to the soul, right? Where psyche is Greek for soul. Eco is oikos, right? Which is both ecology and economy, home. And then logos meaning knowing, right? So that's like the easiest way to think about ecopsychology is knowing that the earth is home to the soul. Really, this seems to be just like a Western, maybe even American version of like an indigenous worldview. So I just wanted to name that, and I'll come back to that in a little bit as well. In 2002, Andy Fisher, who's a Canadian ecopsychologist, published his dissertation called as a book called Radical Ecopsychology. And he talks, his framework is my favorite, and it's what I use when I talk about ecopsychedelics. And so he says that ecopsychology has four tasks. It has a philosophical task, a psychological task, a practical task, and we'll get into all of these later, and then a critical task. Um, so I'll give you two more examples of ecopsychology, and these will just come from me. One is kind of my elevator pitch because often people, when I say that I'm a professor in ecopsychology, people are like, "What the heck is that?" And so then I simply say, "Look, there's a way in which psychology needs ecology. Like psychology as an academic discipline is in the 1800s with Wilhelm Wundt, right? And the academic discipline of ecology didn't even exist then. It's not until later, and like the 1910s, 1920s, people like the Odoms or Aldo Leopold are coming up with it. So really, the beginnings of the academic discipline of psychology didn't really have an understanding of ecology. And then vice versa, right? Like ecology really needs psychology. We've been trying shame and blame in the environmental movement for 70 years now, and we haven't really budged the needle that much. And so maybe we could use some psychological understandings of what actually changes behavior and then use that as a way of undertaking our environmental movement aims. And then lastly, the easiest one is just it's about reconnection, and it's about reconnection to your authentic self, reconnection to other human beings, reconnection to the more than human world, and reconnection to the ground of being. We live in a culture that tries to separate us from all of those things. And so ecopsychology is just reconnection. So here's some concepts that come from the discipline of ecopsychology. So Mitchell Thomashow is an educator who talked about an ecological identity. Um, and in his book, he kind of contrasts that with like, let's say you have a political identity. And so you could do that through a label. You could also understand that through, what you got from your parents or experiences that you had relative to politics. Um, and so he extrapolates that uh, awareness of one's own political identity to the concept of ecological identity. So, what were your parents' relationships to nature like? What have your experiences in nature been? And so that you kind of come to this understanding of like what your own ecological identity is. So that's one. This is borrowed from the philosophical discipline of deep ecology with Arnie Ness, but there's this understanding of an ecological self. And Ness talks about how through a process of self-actualization that you could actually start to think about yourself as an ecological self that is bigger than just your egoic self. Um, the Thich Nhat Hanh's poem about how there's a cloud in this sheet of paper really helps me to do that, right? Where he talks about, that there was a cloud that rained, the rain went into the tree roots, the tree used that water to turn it into a tree to itself. The tree got cut down, the tree was turned into paper, and when Thich Nhat Hanh is writing the poem, he sees the cloud in the piece of paper. To me, that's like a beautiful poetic example of what thinking about an ecological self might be, just all of these relationships interbeing. And then the last one is an ecological unconscious. And this is from Rozak. This like borrows on Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, but kind of deepens it into uh, the more than human world. So it's not just a repository of all of these like kind of human archetypes, but it's life's repository of biological archetypes that we can kind of draw on. And that was one of my students' art right there. That was for a final in one of my classes. Um, And then lastly, just really quick, just to touch on the difference between ecopsychology and other disciplines like environmental psychology or conservation psychology. One of the biggest differences is that ecopsychology is relational in the sense that it tries to problematize the concept of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, right? Putting ourselves at the top of the pyramid of life, and rather than putting us in the web of life. Whereas environmental psychology or conservation psychology, they don't have that critique inherent in what they do. They can be really human-centered in the sense that it is um, nature can be a backdrop for the human healing, regardless of our relationship to nature, in environmental psychology or conservation psychology. So really quick, I'll go through the four things that Fisher talks about, the tasks of ecopsychology. So the psychological task is kind of internalizing that we are nature. And this is something that we could get into later if we wanted to. I like to problematize that a little bit, in the sense that I feel like we have some agency, so that maybe the things that we do to ourselves and to the world can't necessarily on a certain level be considered nature doing it to itself. And that's philosophical nitpicking, but I think it's fruitful. It's a fun conversation to have. Also, just recognizing that the ecological issues that we're dealing with are actually a pathology of the human psyche. So that's one of the psychological tasks. Um, with the philosophical task, Fisher has these two kind of quotes to identify it. Jung says, "Our psyche is a part of nature, and its enigma is as limitless. Thus, we cannot define either the psyche or nature, but it's sure fun to try." And that's the philosophical side of it. Also, Merleau-Ponty revealed the Earth, who is a philosophical phenomenologist, revealed the Earth as the original field for all human experience, the ultimate source of or necessary ground for a psychological life. So this recognition that like the Earth is ground and the philosophical implications of that. The practical has two parts. So there's a therapeutic part, which addresses the emotional and spiritual conditions underlying the crises, right? So like healing ourselves and healing the emotional and spiritual conditions. And then the second part of the practical is a recollective, like recalling how our human psyches are embedded in and nurtured by the animate world. For me, the practical is most embodied by, in ecopsychology, is most embodied by nature connection practices. So we have a lot of nature connection practices that we learn and do in the program that I teach in, which really gives you the therapeutic, it's healing, and the recollective, like, oh my gosh, like this, I am this, and this is my family, are usually results of nature connection. And then the last one is critical. So understanding the historical roots and implications of the anthropocentrism, something that might be interested or interesting to the process and faith community would be something like Lynn White Jr.'s um, historical roots of the ecological crisis, I think came out in the 1970s, and he tries to implicate you know, Christian conceptions of domination as like one of the sources, one of the modern sources of this. And so it's like that kind of critical lens that we can bring to our issues. And then I think this is super important. Fisher also points out that a lot of the critique is cultural. So that would be an example of it being cultural, right? So the way that maybe the Christian religion has played in the domination of nature, at least in the recent past. Um, but Fisher's really asking us to also have a social critique and to name the racist, sexist, classist. That's his words, but we could put any of the isms that we want to in there, And so the institutions and structures that keep these things in place and what we can do to actually challenge those institutions, he thinks it's super important to include that. Okay, here's I just thought this is like a personal joke for me in the sense that like I this is one of my assumptions in terms of process thinking. And I thought it was so funny that like here I am just trying to draw something as immense as, an understanding of what happens in the universe in every moment. And so this is how I understand process thinking, right? That the whole past universe goes into the making of an actual occasion, which is, a being's continual momentary existence throughout time. And that those moments have implications for the whole future universe. And so, like, we as actual occasions ourselves are connected to the entire past universe, and we have implications for the future universe. Um, and I forgot to draw free will in there. So, and we have free will, right? Which I think is important. And then I have God up there and I like to think of it this way. Um, and again, process people can call me out at the end, but I like to think of God as like just this like whisper of like the greater possibility that is always present as agents with free will can make their choices. And so that's like, this little dotted line that's present through all of these actual occasions occurring. So that's the first assumption that I'm making in terms of process thought. And the second one is just, essentially pan-experientialism or panpsychism. I was just refreshing myself with Matt Siegel's uh, article about this so that I could try to be nuanced. But again, this is not necessarily my area of expertise. And so just that consciousness or awareness, like whatever term we want to use for that, is suffused throughout reality. But again, a coffee mug's awareness is probably just at the level of the individual atoms that make up that coffee mug. A single cell organism has some kind of awareness of itself that is beyond just the atoms that make it up. Multicellular organisms probably have an even greater awareness than single-celled organisms, and I had fun talking to John Cobb about that, like these new understandings of plants, where maybe some old process thinking was attached to nervous system, and that plants didn't have that, and yet it seemed like plants had awareness, and so there's a growing understanding of that. Humans, right, having a particular awareness relative to the complexity that we have and the organization that comes along with it. And then I'll talk about this later. I had a question with John Cobb because in teaching ecopsychology, and at least at Naropa, we have essentially like a rite of passage. It's a person's wilderness experience course with a 3-day fasting solo in the middle of it. And people who have these kinds of experiences will talk about like, well, the canyon told me that I needed to do this, right? And so I said, John, like, what am I supposed to do with that relative to, this understanding that I have from process? There's no way that a canyon has, consciousness or awareness. John was open to it. Like, he had that beautiful capacity to just be open to, human experiences and then trying to explain those experiences and not dismiss them. So, that is an open question that we could talk about. I think I'm going to skip this one, and I can come back to it. This is from an article that I wrote as part of my dissertation, and it essentially talks about process metaphysics as it relates to agriculture. Um, and it comes from my reading of The Liberation of Life by Birch and Cobb. I can come back to it if necessary. It's pretty long. Um, okay, so taking ecopsychology and taking process thought. Now I'm going to move into what me and my colleagues are calling ecopsychedelics. And this is my take on it. Like if you were to listen to a talk by a colleague of mine named Mickey Fire, um, she's a clinical psychologist who was the chair of the wilderness therapy program at Naropa. She comes to this project through a very therapeutic psychological lens, whereas I'm coming at it from a philosophical lens. And so here's some of the things that we can think about together. Um, so I'll talk about ethics and whether or not there's a psychedelic worldview. I'll mention alternative worldviews, the possibility of alternative worldviews, and then even the possibility of a definition of psychedelics. There isn't an agreed upon one, which I think is philosophically interesting. Um, there's a connection with me between ecopsychedelics and sustainability. And I'll show you the poster that I presented in 2019 at that sustainability conference. And it has most of those kind of topics on there. And then I'll also talk about, ecopsychedelics and the role that ecopsychology can play in the psychedelic world, especially with the resurgence of psychedelics that's happening right now. Um, so with the philosophy, um, one of the first things, and this kind of helped to spur that conference on exceptional experiences that we had at Claremont. Um, I was reading the book True Hallucinations by Terence McKenna, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it's one of the craziest books I've ever read. He and his brother go in this early 70s, Terence and Dennis go to Brazil and have a psychedelic adventure there way back in the Amazon. And as Terence is trying to describe what happened, he gets to the end of the book and he said, well, the best way that I could even describe it is like just with Whiteheadian metaphysics, like just look that stuff up. And so that's what caused me to reach out to John Cobb and say, like, wait a minute, like, did you know that Terence McKenna like said this about process thinking? And it just so happened that that conference was already like in its initial stages of being planned, and so I got folded into that. So that was one of the places where ecopsychedelics started. Another one is that Krishnamurti quote, that it's no sign of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. Um, and so when this psychedelic resurgence started, especially with Michael Pollan's book, I think which is like 2017 or 2018, I thought to myself like, yeah, well, what if we cured someone's treatment-resistant depression only to send them back into their tiny little apartment in Manhattan where they just go back down onto the subway and then go back to their insurance job at a cubicle, and we never actually address the root of the treatment-resistant depression, which is the sick society that we live in. Like, is it ethical for us to use psychedelics to do that? So that was one of the questions that came up. Another one, which we'll talk about later, is there a worldview inherent to the psychedelic experience? And this is something Dr. Soshed Hughes wrote a paper on, and so y'all can find that paper. Relative to even Michael Pollan's experience in that book, when you get to the end of How to Change Your Mind, he says, look, I'm a scientific materialist. I've had crazy experiences on psychedelics that have healed me and has changed my relationship to reality. And yet, I'm just going to go back to scientific materialism because I don't really know what else to do. And so then Peter wrote this amazing paper, which is essentially like, hey, as a part of psychedelic assisted therapies protocol, should we be offering people alternative worldviews than the scientific materialist worldview that is kind of the default worldview of modernity? And then Peter also like talks about, well, what would be the range of acceptable alternatives? And so I love that paper. And my students in my ecopsychedelics class really resonated with it as well. And then, yeah, like I said, is there agreed upon definition of what substances are psychedelic? Because um, there is a neurological one based on their neurochemistry. Uh, but then something like MDMA is has to be called like an empathogen, right? Like, so it's not necessarily psychedelics. MDMA might be considered an empathogen. And then the organization that I was talking about earlier, Medicinal Mindfulness, they've been doing cannabis-assisted psychotherapy for years. Um, and it is very psychedelic. But again, like cannabis does not meet the neurochemical criteria for um, psychedelics. And so I'm just interested in, what are the ways that we could define psychedelics? Um, I'll come back to that one if we need to. We already talked about it a little bit. Psychedelic worldview. So here and this really came out of the conference that Sherry and I were at. Is there a psychedelic worldview? There's reasons to think that there is. Like most people have experiences of interconnectedness, and I'm going to come back to this in a really ironic way later in the presentation. Um, so that seems inherent. A lot of people have animistic experiences as a result of their psychedelic experience. Many people have experiences that consciousness is primary. Oh my gosh, I need to fly through this. Um, well, even uh, Albert Hoffman talked about that by having his LSD experience that there was a crack in materiality. Like, so he himself started to question the scientific materialist worldview. There's other things. I'll just go through those. There are reasons to think no, there isn't. Charles Manson and what he did with psychedelics is a reason to think that there's maybe not a psychedelic worldview. There's people who think that it just magnifies things that are already there. There's questions about its suggestibility. Stan Groff calls them non-specific amplifiers. I kind of think that maybe eco-psychedelics or a psychedelic worldview is paradox. And here's just a couple reasons why. Took the study of chemicals to bring interiority back to psychology. I find that to be ironic or paradoxical. We're using science to undermine the scientific worldview. I think that's paradoxical. And there's even some research that shows, empirically, that the more mystical experience a person has, the more efficacious it is, right? So that seems to be kind of paradoxical. Um, I'll go through this really quick because I would much rather have these conversations with you all. So here's like maybe how psychedelics could intersect with sustainability. Many environmental philosophies are based on interconnectedness, and psychedelics can engender those. Psychedelics can help with existential distress. Psychedelics can help with anxiety and depression, which are right now rational responses to the poly crisis that we're in. Psychedelics can help with addiction, where eco-psychologists like Bill Plotkin would say that our biggest addiction is to our worldview. Um, Experiences of awe, experiences of open-mindedness, and I could tell you a story at the end if you're interested about how the compact disc was born. It was psychedelics. Um, and so then, yeah, bringing eco-psychology into this explicitly, like the Western medical model is what is being used to bring about this psychedelic resurgence. And so just the pathologizing that comes around that, right, as opposed to spiritual emergencies. Um, Ecopsychology brings questions around cultural appropriation. Peggy Ayers wrote a book called Ancient Spirit Rising that talks about us returning to our roots, us being the colonizers of European ancestry. Um, and a book like The Immortality Key that is talking about maybe some of the historical psychedelic ritualistic roots that we have from Europe. Um, yeah, are we doing these medicines in an office or outdoors as they're traditionally being used? Even the term medicine, which I just used, ecopsychology would say that these are beings, right? That we are in relationship to mushrooms, vine, cactuses, molds. Um, and then, yeah, that's the Metzner quote that I used. And so then lastly, in terms of ecopsychedelics, I taught this class, and so here are the things that I kind of have come out of me teaching this class, newer understandings that I have. The community's role in individual healing, healing, whether it's psychological or physical, and then whether it's individual or collective. Um, yeah, throughout the course, regardless of the readings that I assigned, there was a lot of questions around ontology and epistemology. And so again, I think process thinking could have something to say here, especially around metaphysics or even with epistemology, the concept of prehension. And I still think that there's an open question around worldviews, right? Like, so when Groff says that they're non-specific amplifiers, maybe that's just specific to LSD as opposed to ibogaine, where people find a grandfatherly presence to be with them while they're having this experience, or ayahuasca, where people have a grandmotherly presence around this. Like that doesn't seem to be non-specific. It actually seems to be very specific. And then the most disturbing part, and this is why I have Plantier here with us, um, was there's an individual named Neshe Devaneux out of Harvard, who's been doing a lot of research on right-wing psychedelia. And so what actually happens is what I talked about earlier, that experience of interconnectedness. It gets co-opted so that the narrative becomes, yeah, everything's connected like a pyramid is connected, but somebody has to be at the top, and it's the right-wing, alt-right people who think that they deserve to be at the top of that pyramid. And so they still have experiences of interconnectedness, but it gets filtered or funneled into these right-wing worldviews. And then, yeah, I used John Buchanan. I think we probably all in these process areas all know John, and I used his book, Processing Reality, a bit as well. So just to review real quick. So, um, ecopsychology, one of the things that is amazing to me is Joanna Macy always invokes how we are genetic kin to every being on this planet, right? And so that I think that's an ecopsychological version of this, right? How we are in process metaphysics connected to everything. And then with the second assumption, uh, around consciousness, that really overlaps, that kind of panpsychism really overlaps with animism that seems to be inherent in ecopsychology. And so that's a interesting, probably fruitful place for us to explore. And then also just this understanding that these psychedelic medicines are actually beings. And so process philosophy kind of honors that relative to their interiority and complexity. Um, and then, so this is, I can't really see what the title of this is because my little Zoom bar is in front of it. So we'll say that we are. Yeah, that was just so the intersection of it was a review of what we just went through. Ta-da. So this is what I did with eco psychedelics and my students. Like we're just making this up right now, like as this psychedelic resurgence is happening. And so like you can be a part of this. We are open source and are just like mycelium, just exploring the world as we move along. And so I would love to hear y'all's thoughts.